urban travel in the first place. Looking at some of the fundamental decisions that any decision maker would look at in case of travel dimensions in a typical urban context. First is whether to go out for a travel or not, for a trip or not. And next is where to go, how to reach that place and which route, which essentially translates into trip frequency, the number of trips that one would conduct in an urban scenario on a day-to-day basis. Second would be to choose this destination. Third is a mode choice, and fourth is a route. This is a typical, it's a disaggregate version of a typical four-step model process, and the fundamental decisions that any decision maker would look at in a typical urban context. This mode choice especially has implications on very high-level transportation planning decisions. It also has significant implications on the mobility demands and what we actually see as traffic manifest on the roads are essentially summum bonum of the mode choice decisions for every urban travel decision maker takes. And finally, from understanding the underlying behavior of a mode choice, we would also be, as analysts, able to propose make informed policy decisions with regards to infrastructure. And that's why studying mode choice decisions would be a significant contributor to understanding urban travel. So to begin with, first, choice process itself. There are four fundamental elements of any discrete choice process. First is the decision maker. Second is a set of alternatives which he faces. In this case, it is the set of alternatives, set of modal alternatives, urban travel modal alternatives that are available for an individual. As we see here, two-wheeler, car, bus, company bus, cycle, these are typical alternatives that are available in a typical urban context. And the set of attributes related to both the alternatives as well as the attributes related to the decision maker. First set of attributes that are related to alternatives, say for example, travel cost, travel distance, or travel time. These are factors. These are some of the examples of factors related to the alternatives, and the attributes related to decision maker like income, vehicle ownership, making joint trips, etc. And finally, the decision rule. Decision rule refers to an information processing mechanism which uses the information available regarding alternatives and attributes to aid the decision maker in arriving at his choice. Typically, some of the conventional decision rules that have been adopted are random utility maximization and random regret minimization. So, moving to the motivation, in case of alternatives, so my research essentially looked at these four fundamental elements of choice and heterogeneity in behavior with respect to these four dimensions. So, with regards to alternatives, the user preferences with respect to IPT modes, intermediate public transport modes, were not very well understood at that point of time, especially with regards to Chennai. If you look at some of the IPT modes that are available in Chennai, they are auto rickshaws, shared autos, and company bus. And these attributes are significantly different from each other in terms of their attributes. For example, the fare, if you look at auto rickshaws and shared autos, they are distance based, whereas we had a flat fare for company bus. In terms of availability, auto rickshaws are always available everywhere, universal availability. But shared autos were available only in the selected corridors. And company buses are only available during selected periods and accessible only for selected members who are provided with such services. And if you look at accessibility, auto rickshaws provided door-to-door access. Shared autos provides the least access, whereas company buses provides egress end access. So if you look at attributes, all these three modes had significant difference among them. And the one other component was typically because these services were very limited in case of, especially in case of urban commute trips like work, they generally tend to be combined as a composite alternative. But this led to biased coefficients and inferences, and the impact of modeling them as a composite alternative or as a combined alternative is not well investigated. And of course, as I already said, the shares of the mode shares of share auto and auto rickshaws are significant You can see here that they were carrying significant amount of trips in comparison to, say, the other public transport modes in the city, as reported by some of the studies in 2011. So another thing which we wanted to look at was a decision rule. So typically, analysts assume the decision rule to be homogeneous across decision makers. That means he assumes one decision rule for the entire population, be it utility maximization or say distributed immunization or other conjunctive or disjunctive decision rule. He assumed every decision maker, he assumes the decision makers to adopt the same decision rule. And there was not a significant amount of study which allowed for decision rule heterogeneity among decision makers. And besides, some of the very few studies which looked for this decision rule heterogeneity also did not significantly account for the factors affecting the choice of these decision makers. But that was one another direction in which they wanted to work on. In terms of attributes, both preference and response heterogeneity is associated with captivity. Here, captivity I'm referring to as captivity with respect to non-personal modes. So the people, decision makers varied in terms of their captivity, the extent of captivity. So the degree of captivity also varied. So in this particular study, we have defined captivity as say people who did not own personal vehicles or did not have driving knowledge. Both were considered captive because they did not have personal vehicle access. And they further, the degree of captivity also varied. For example, some of the households where the number of earning members or number of workers were more than the number of vehicles owned, they had certain degree of captivity at the household level. Finally, captivity, people who did not have these restrictions, we call them as choice makers. So there was a variation in the degree of captivity. So there was a potential heterogeneity in the behavior with regards to mode choice as the captivity varied. And the number of the people who conducted the trips were also classified in terms of the number of people. So we classified trip makers as, or the trips as joint trips versus solo trips. So there was potential heterogeneity in that direction also. Finally, with regards to choice set, conventionally analysts assume the choice set to be deterministic. So once a set of alternatives is not available, they are excluded from the choice set, which means that automatically the rest of the alternatives were included completely into the choice set, or they were allowed to vary across decision makers. Now, these allowed only for a deterministic choice set representation. And one another way of modeling was to assume the choice set to be completely probabilistic in the sense that the consideration of an alternative in the choice set was assumed to be latent. So whether it was deterministically included or excluded was assumed to be random and modeled probabilistically. So we had two set of choice set representations where either the choice set was completely deterministic or it was allowed to be completely fully probabilistic. But we know that the treatment, the alternatives needed to be treated differently on a case-by-case basis. So there was a necessity to model to allow for deterministic choice set treatment as well as probabilistic treatment. So we needed a framework where the framework allowed each individual alternatives to be treated deterministically as well as probabilistically as the case may be. So, summarizing research gaps, we looked at heterogeneity in alternatives, so user preferences for distinct and unique IPT modes like company-person responsiveness to their attributes merited further investigation. Impacts of combining distinct elemental IPT alternatives into a single composite alternative remains to be understood. And there was also not enough policies directed to improving ridership of elemental IPT. Heterogeneity in decision rule was also investigated as part of the study. Heterogeneity due to attributes, contextual factors like source and degree of captivity and presence of co-passengers using distinct mode choice alternatives was also investigated. Heterogeneity in choice set. So deterministic choice set models do not account for stochasticity in choice set formation. But whereas the probabilistic, fully probabilistic choice set models failed to recognize that the exclusion or inclusion of alternatives, of at least some of the alternatives, could be deterministic. So, deterministic inclusion is a natural assumption and not empirically founded, whereas treatment of deterministic versus probabilistic treatment of alternatives could vary across respondents. So, there needs to be a differentiation between deterministic inclusion versus probabilistic inclusion. So, in order to address some of these research gaps, primarily four objectives were framed for the thesis. One is to analyze heterogeneity in choice of distinct IPT modes in a developing context, investigate heterogeneity in decision rules using commute mode choice, evaluate variation in mode choice due to differences in source and degree of capacity and reservoir potential, and to accommodate heterogeneity between probabilistic and deterministic consideration of alternative choice. The scope was limited to urban travel mode choice among working commuters in Chennai city. The study area was Chennai urban area. The data was collected from primarily 8 meta zones, and the data consisted of 872 workers. The data was collected using face-to-face interviews. The kind of data that was collected, included socioeconomic vehicle ownership characteristics, work-related details, and qualitative factors, and also factors which affected public transport as well as personal vehicle choices. Found that the average household size of the sample was 4.37 as compared to census data at that time, which is 4.51. Average worker age was 36.9 as compared to 38. Average household income was 15,527 in comparison to the census data of 14,500. So more or less, the sample data was kind of representative of the population in Chennai city at that time. The mode share was typically motorized two-wheelers carry 42% of the mode share. Cars accounted for 6%. Bus and train together contributed to around 37% of the share. Non-motorized vehicles, walk and cycle trips contributed to 66% of the share. IPT modes, share auto rickshaw, and company bus accounted for 9% of the shares, of which company bus carried the major share. So moving to the objective one, where we looked at heterogeneity in preference and choice towards distinct IPT modes. We considered three IPT modes, basically auto rickshaw, company bus, and shared auto. We looked at two things. First is, suppose essentially IPT, because it was a fringe mode and there was not sufficient share also in IPT. Typically, analysts tend to combine the IPT alternative. They can be combined because of multiple reasons. One could be sample size, another could be the lack of information about the elemental IPT alternative choice, or because the attributes were very similar across IPT alternatives, they could be combined. So there was multiple reasons why analysts combine. But when we combine, it leads to bias in the model estimation. So how to combine these elemental alternatives? So here I am showing using a typical example. There were two structures which was assumed. One is a linear utility structure and another is a non-linear utility structure. In the linear utility structure, I assume only one alternative. So here I am showing using travel cost. So I simply arithmetically average the attributes of the elemental IPT alternatives of auto, company bus, and share auto to find out the travel cost of IPT and include that in the utility specification. So here the utility of IPT is the constant for IPT and the travel cost of IPT along with its sensitivity parameter. Whereas the non-utility structure would allow for individual utilities to be specified for each alternative, and then I take the maximum utility within that nest. So a new non-utility structure was proposed as an alternative to specify while you are combining elemental IPT alternative. And the second part of the work looked at the implications of combining elemental IPT alternatives. And because analysts were forced to combine elemental IPT alternatives, if they have to do so, what would be the resulting bias? What would be the implications of bias and the probabilities of both the IPT shares as well as elemental shares? So we used the synthetic data and we allowed for three different attribute aggregation strategies. One is the arithmetic averaging attributes, what I have shown here, or market share weighted. This market share came from the household interview surveys, and or the choice-based attribute aggregation strategy. We assumed four different scenarios, which came from low and high IPT shares, and within each of these IPT shares, we also assumed balance and skewed elemental IPT shares. Balance meaning the difference in individual IPT shares within the IPT, elemental IPT shares within the IPT umbrella was almost negligible. And if it was significantly different among, say, in case of auto, share auto, and company bus, it was assumed to be skewed. So that led to four different scenarios. And the sample size also was varied from 250 to 2000 in steps of 250. And each of this was done with 1000 draws. So looking at the first case, how to combine elemental IPT alternatives, we had three different structures where fundamentally we allowed for a fully disaggregate model. So some of the restrictions that we looked at was lumping the utility, aggregating the attributes, constraining the coefficients to be generic across IPT alternatives, or combining the alternatives altogether. So these are the four restrictions that we looked at. The linear utility model is the fully aggregated model M1, which made all these restrictions, whereas the fully disaggregate model M3 relaxed all these assumptions. And the non-linear utility model did not lump utility, aggregate attributes, or constraint coefficients, but they combined the alternatives. This allowed for comparison across different combinations of the model. So we saw that the nonlinear utility model performed significantly well than the linear utility model statistically. And obviously, in case of the 8 alternative case, the 6 versus 8 comes because of the combining of the alternatives, IPT alternatives. So essentially, we had 8 alternatives. When you combine within the IPT, it leads to 6 alternative case. So the fully disaggregate model, where you do not where you do not make any of these restrictions, it is an 8 alternative model case. So ideally, we would want to have a fully disaggregate model. But in case you have to combine, then a non-linear utility model would be a better option than a linear utility model. This was shown statistically. And some of the other findings we saw was that while you combine alternatives, it led to poorer fit than constraining utilities alone. And combining alternatives biases only the coefficients influencing the utilities of IPT modes, and it did not bias the coefficients of the modes other than IPT. Whereas constraining IPT utilities biases, constraining meaning allowing for the coefficients to be generic across the IPT utility. It biases the coefficients of utilities of the other IPT, the non-IPT modes also. One of the policies that we tested was typically in Chennai city, it is customary to double charge, means charge for a potential empty return trip, meaning that supposing your IPT fare as per the regulatory tariff is close to 40 rupees, you might end up paying 80 rupees, almost double the fare. So we considered the auto fare to be typically actually double the fare. That means there was no compliance to the regulatory tariff fixed by the government. So if we allowed at least 20% or 40, 60% or 20 to 60% of auto drivers to comply to the regulatory tariff, we saw that the typical auto shares increased from 1 to 4%. And as we did this with the auto rickshaw, we saw that auto rickshaw did not compete with IPT modes like shared auto and company bus. Instead, it started drawing shares from other non-sustainable modes like personal vehicles like two-wheeler and car. So IPT had its own distinct markets when you allow for policies. And the other part was to find out the implications of combining elemental IPT alternatives. So we saw that the IPT shares, we had, as we already discussed, we had 4 different scenarios. If the analyst wanted to have a significant prediction, a reliable prediction of IPT shares, it would happen very reliably in a high IPT share case with balanced elemental IPT shares. Whereas if we wanted to have reliable prediction of elemental IPT shares, he would want to have the IPT shares to be high with skewed elemental IPT shares. The aggregation of attributes rendered the least bias when the sample size was in the order of 75, 750 to 1000. And that happened in scenario 1, which is low IPT shares with skewed elemental IPT shares. And the best aggregation strategy, attribute aggregation strategy, we compared across different aggregation strategies. Arithmetic mean, where we typically compute the arithmetic mean of elemental IPT attributes, or the market share weighted, or the choice set based. The arithmetic mean was found to be the best aggregation strategy. And one of the other things was there was no significant reduction in bias beyond the sample size of 1000. So this can be seen here. You can see with respect to this market share aggregation strategy that the bias in the probability in elemental IPT probability is decreased till a sample size of say 750 to 1000. Beyond that, there was no significant reduction in the bias. And the arithmetic mean attribute aggregation strategy rendered the least bias. Going to objective 2 with respect to decision rule heterogeneity. We proposed two decision rule heterogeneity. One, we looked at two decision rules basically. One is the random utility maximization, where the decision maker is assumed to choose that alternative for which he or she perceives maximum utility. The other decision rule that we looked at was random regret minimization. So RUM and RRM, where regret involved binary comparisons of attributes with respect to every pair of alternatives. And regret being a negative utility component, the probability is dependent on the negative of regret, meaning that that alternative is assumed to be chosen, which renders you the least regret. So you had a pure RUM model where you assume all the decision makers to be fully utility maximizers, whereas the RRM model assumed every decision maker to be fully regret minimizer. So both these decision rule models were homogeneous, meaning that the decision rule was assumed to be same across all the decision makers. Composite decision rules, we classified certain attributes as utility based and certain others as regret based. For example, travel time or travel cost, which varied across the alternatives, was assumed to be regret based. We conducted an analysis to figure out which attributes can be classified as regret based and which to be as regret based. So composite utility was developed where certain attributes were evaluated utility based and certain others as regret based. Again, note that still the decision rule assumption is homogeneous because the utility based attributes remain to be evaluated as utility based across the decision makers. So the decision rule did not change across the decision makers, but it allowed for variation only across attributes. Whereas the heterogeneous decision rule framework allowed for the decision rule to vary across decision makers, and the degree to which the decision maker was assumed to be a utility maximizer or regret minimizer was assumed to be latent, and so modeled the probability. A binary logic model was allowed to predict the probability of being a utility maximizer versus a regret minimizer, and that way the decision rule varied across decision makers. So some of the findings was that both the CDR and the HDR, the composite decision rule and the heterogeneous decision rule performed better than both the pure homogeneous RUM and RRM decision rule models. And in case of composite decision rule framework, we saw that the attributes which are utility based were comfort, safety, and work distance, whereas the attributes which were regret based, where decision makers used regret minimization principle to evaluate attributes were travel time, travel costs, reliability, and accessibility. In case of HDR model, the heterogeneous decision rule model, those decision makers who were sensitive to travel time, accessibility, and work distance tend to behave like utility maximizers more than regret minimizers. Whereas those decision makers who were sensitive to personal vehicle travel costs or reliability tend to behave more like regret minimizers. Decision makers who were sensitive to share auto, travel cost, and comfort factors had even decision rule conformity, meaning they were not either completely utility maximizers or regretting. Looking further, in case of the HDR framework, the utility maximizers tend to behave more like personal vehicle captive. Their preference for personal vehicle was more in comparison to public transport, whereas the regret minimizers were not very specifically captive to any particular class of modes. The commuters who perform long distance trips and who were sensitive to bus frequency tend to behave more as regret minimizers than utility maximizers. Commuters who perform joint trips, that means who travel with other family members or who are personal vehicle captive, tend to be more of utility maximizers. Who had flexible work scheduling hours were also more of utility maximizers. Going to objective 3. So, as I already discussed, there are 4 degrees of captivity that we looked at in the study. One is captive by vehicle ownership, meaning that he does not own personal vehicle, and because of that, he is captive or he is forced to choose among non-personal modes or non-private modes like two-wheeler and car. Captive by driving knowledge refers to captivity to non-personal modes because he lacks or he does not or have driving knowledge, and this is within the captive segment. Commuters who had more working members than the number of vehicles in the household were captive to a certain extent, so this we called a semi-captive segment. Finally, the number of commuters, number of working members, if they are less than or equal to the number of vehicles that are owned in the household, such decision makers we called as the choice segment. So there were 4 degrees of captivity: captive by vehicle ownership, captive by driving knowledge, semi-captive, and choice segment. And 2 categories based on the number of co-passengers. One is a joint trip, one is a solo trip. So put together the 4 degrees of captivity and 2 in terms of the number of co-passengers, 4 into 2, you had 8 segments. So we tried to look at how they varied in terms of they were heterogeneous in terms of their choice behavior. So in the base model, we did not allow for any preference or response heterogeneity with regards to these 8 segments, which is the conventional model, which does not account for any of these heterogeneity. The second model, we allowed for certain level of preference heterogeneity only with regards to innate preference across these 8 segments, joint and solo trips of varied degrees of captivity. And the final model, we allowed for both response as well as preference heterogeneity, both in terms of constants, innate preferences, as well as in terms of attributes, travel time or travel cost. We allowed for heterogeneity among these 8 segments. So when we compare these 3 models, M1, M2, and M4, obviously we saw that the model which accounted for both preference and response heterogeneity across these 8 segments had the best had the improved fitness of measure than both the other models. More importantly, the preference heterogeneity contributed to significant improvement in likelihood than response heterogeneity. And some of the behavioral findings was that only preference heterogeneity was observed with respect to car, auto rickshaw, and shared auto. Only response heterogeneity was observed with respect to company bus. Both preference and response heterogeneity with respect to two-wheeler, public transport, and this also within semi-captive, there was heterogeneity between joint and solo trip. Captive by driving knowledge commuters had greater preference to bus than personal vehicle and company bus. They were also most sensitive to two-wheeler travel time. The commuters who were captive by vehicle ownership, they had greater preference for bus than train, possibly due to the greater accessibility of bus than train. Semi-captive commuters were insensitive to company bus travel time. In case of personal vehicles, the joint trips, comfort and convenience was found to be more contributing to joint trip heterogeneity. One of the remarks or the findings was that ignoring both forms of heterogeneity led to biased mode shares of each of these 8 segments, and ignoring one of these forms of heterogeneity led to spurious insignificance or significance of the factors that affects the charge. We also tested a policy where we looked at the changes in vehicle ownership over 10 years, over a decade from 2007 to 17. We developed synthetic data analysis based on the vehicle ownership growth rates from 2007 to 17 based on government of Tamil Nadu data. They published a report, and based on that, we have looked at some kind of analysis, and we saw that obviously there will be, with increase in vehicle ownership, these segments might shift. For example, somebody who was captive by vehicle ownership in 2007, because they owned vehicles, they might shift segments to becoming semi-captive or choice segment. So we saw that there was significant reduction in captive segments, almost 13% reduction in captive segments, which led to significant increase in semi-captive and choice segments. And in terms of mode shares, we saw that the two-wheeler shares would significantly increase from 42% to 53%, and significant reduction in public transport as well as non-motorist shares. And we did not see any appreciable decrease in the car shares. Moving to the fourth objective, which is heterogeneity in probabilistic versus deterministic consideration of alternatives. Conventionally, choice set were considered to be fully deterministic, where all the alternatives in the universal choice set is assumed to be available for the decision maker. Or the other form of deterministic treatment of choice set is where certain alternatives, for example, if I do not own a car and a bus, and I do not have access to or I do not consider bus in my choice set, they are automatically excluded from the choice set, meaning that rest of the alternatives is fully available to me. So I either allow the choice set to be deterministic, or I allow the alternatives choice set treatment to be completely latent, hidden, probabilistic, meaning each alternative is considered to be present in my choice set to varying degrees. Meaning a two-wheeler might be present not fully, it might be present say 60 to 70% in my choice set, whereas a company bus might be present to 90%. Non-motor cycle might be present only 10% in my choice set. So I am allowing differential treatment, but here I am assuming the treatment to be completely probabilistic. So I am not allowing for deterministic treatment, meaning I am not completely excluding or completely including any alternative in my choice set. Ideally, I would want my framework to allow this treatment to be random. That means any given alternative should be allowed to be deterministic or random. So we need essentially a partially probabilistic framework where different alternatives are treated differently. That means a given choice set should have deterministic exclusion of certain alternatives, deterministic inclusion of certain alternatives, whereas fully probabilistic treatment for certain other alternatives. And this should also vary across decision makers. It should vary across decision makers as well as alternatives within the choice set. So we need a methodological framework which allowed random treatment of choice set, random treatment of consideration of alternatives within the choice set, and it should vary across decision makers. So in this particular study, we assumed that the bus was either probabilistic considered, or it could be deterministically included. For decision makers who was well within 750 meters of when the bus stop was within 750 meters from their household, we assumed it to be deterministically included, and when the distance was beyond 750 meters, we assumed it to be probabilistically considered. And for modes like non-motorized and suburban railway systems, we allowed it to be probabilistically included and excluded when the decision makers felt that the non-motorized modes was not a physically feasible option, or when the train was beyond when the railway station was beyond 3 kilometers, we assumed that the decision maker may not consider that in the choice. Whereas in case of IPT modes, we completely assumed it to be random. That means we allowed probabilistic consideration for the alternative. In case of personal vehicles, we allowed it to be deterministically excluded, deterministically included, or probabilistic considered as the case may be. So it led to two different model frameworks. One where we assumed it to be fully random, fully probabilistic choice set model, and one where we allowed these differential treatments. One special case of this framework was developed known as the partially probabilistic and heterogeneous consideration model, M2. So now we compare these models statistically, M1 and M2. Obviously, we saw that the partially and probabilistically choice set models, which allowed for deterministic treatment for certain alternatives, deterministic exclusion, deterministic inclusion for certain alternatives, and probabilistic treatment for certain others. M2 had an improved fit than M1, and we also saw that average consideration probabilities in M1 were significantly different from 0 for segments that are deterministically excluded in M2, and from 1 for segments that are completely included in M2. Here we are showing, here is a graph which shows for a typical case this actually is a graph of mode shares, the predicted mode shares. The green ones is the observed share, and we can see that the orange one is the M2. So in all three graphs, the first graph is for in case of for commuters who deterministically exclude train in M2. So we see that the M2 predicts the predicted shares for M2 is it's closely matching with the observed shares as opposed to the fully probabilistic model M1. Similarly, in case of deterministically included, those decision makers who deterministically include bus, the mode shares, the predicted mode shares match closely with M2, whereas overestimated in many modes, say from bus and train, in case of M1. Similarly, the predicted mode shares were very close to M2, whereas not so in case of M1. So some of the model results and key findings were there that the choice set misspecification in M1 led to bias sensitivity. And the proposed model, the M2 captures differential sensitivity between deterministically included and probabilistically considered modes. For example, suppose bus is deterministically included for somebody, whereas the same bus is probabilistically considered by somebody else. So how do these two decision makers differ in terms of their sensitivity? So that was also captured in the model. Finally, we saw that in case of certain modes, the policies which led to improvement or the policies which are directed at improvement in consideration was improved the bus shares rather than policies which improve the that attempt to improve the choice probabilities. So finally concluding, the work behaviorally attempted to develop richer models that accounts for heterogeneity due to differences among distinct IPT alternatives, differences in decision rules, differences in contextual factors involving source and intensity of captivity and presence of co-passengers. It also accounted for heterogeneity in alternatives. It accounted for heterogeneity in decision rules. We developed a CDR composite decision rule framework, which allowed for variation in attribute treatments, but still the decision rule was homogeneous. We also developed the heterogeneous decision rule framework, which allowed for variation between regret minimizer versus utility maximizer. Then it also allowed for heterogeneity. We accounted for heterogeneity attribute differences between captivity and the presence of co-passengers. And finally, we looked at heterogeneity in probabilistic versus deterministic consideration of alternate. So some of the key contributions from the thesis come from a methodological perspective. The thesis proposes a set of generalized decision rule framework that allows attributes to be evaluated by decision rules that also for different decision makers to adopt different decision rules. It also proposed a generalized framework which essentially allows alternatives to be either deterministically included, deterministically excluded, or probabilistically considered. From a behavioral perspective, it captured differences in choice behavior among elemental alternatives between utility maximizers and regret minimizers, and among commuters who differ in their source and degree of captivity to non-personal modes and number of capacity. It also captured differences between deterministic inclusion and probabilistic inclusion of working people. From a practitioner perspective, we proposed policies or we demonstrated scenarios with respect to specific IPT, which directed at specific IPT mode shares like auto rickshaws and company bus. And we also looked at some of the scenarios or policies that could improve public transport shares at both consideration level as well as the choice level. We also looked at the effect of increased vehicle ownership in the last decade. So the limitations of this work was we have not included or accounted for the choice of app-based services, and some of the assumptions like low and high IPT shares as well as balanced and skewed intra-IPT shares. The thresholds that we accounted were purely arbitrary and the results are subjective according to that. We assume decision rule heterogeneity only among utility maximizers and regret minimizers. One could also think about adopting other decision rules into this. And the attributes and its thresholds adopted to define deterministic inclusion and exclusion are purely data specific. They are empirical to this. They are purely to this data. So, if you want to suppose apply the same framework to other scenario, so we would have to probably look into the empirical situations in that particular city or in that particular scenario. So, these are some of the selected references, and these are some of the visible outputs. I will take this opportunity to acknowledge my research supervisor at IIT Madras, Dr. Karthik Srinivasan, for having guided me, helped me finish my PhD work at IIT Madras. I'm thankful to the Center of Excellence in Urban Transport at IIT Madras, funded by the I'm also thankful to all my teachers, doctor committee members, and lab mates and project staff who helped me sail through my PhD. Thank you, one and all. Maybe you want to ask any questions? Thank you, guys. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Now the platform is open for questions. Questions can be posted in the chat box also.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm Anila from NATPAC. It was a wonderful presentation. Actually, I have one doubt. That is, we have the captive riders using because of the vehicle ownership. Those are not having vehicles, and the other one is the without having the valid driving license. So how much they will be differing? Like, for example, the one with vehicle ownership, most probably they will be having the driving license. So will it impact much on the decision making?
Okay. Now, I want to clarify here that I'm not looking at driving license because I had in my data, when I collected data, I asked separate questions to find out whether they have a driving license versus driving knowledge. So I specifically asked driving knowledge. So this classification which I have shown here as part of the study is actually captive by driving knowledge. So this is not based on driving license, because many a times we find that they have driving license but they lack driving knowledge, and vice versa. Some of them did not have driving license, but then they had driving knowledge. So I would consider that the later actually influenced the choice rather than the driving license. So driving knowledge may not necessarily lead to an ownership decision. That's why we saw
driving knowledge. Driving knowledge may not affect, but if the person is having a vehicle, then most probably he'll be having driving knowledge as well, right? I don't
No,
know the
I'll tell you.
statistical, like how much, like is there any percentage, like from the data? Can you say something regarding that?
Yeah, yeah. I'll take you to the percentage. But again, one second. I'm not once again. Can I exit the share option?
It is already shared, but the
No,
thank you slide is visible.
then I just want to move to the pieces where I can show the shares. So what happens is this definition, when I say captive is, I have a personal vehicle in my house, but
Okay.
I may not have exclusive access to it, because every time I not have always access to that vehicle. So that is when I say that I have a vehicle, but I am not in a position to access it. So that is one kind of captivity. So that I am capturing in semi-captive segments, where I own a vehicle and I have driving knowledge. But so that part of people whom you are calling, they have a vehicle, but they have driving knowledge, but they are not in a position to use it. For example, there are two people in the house, but only one vehicle. Then one of them surely uses it. The other person might have driving knowledge, but he may not have access to it. So in that case, he is semi-captive. So his choices will not have two-wheeler or car completely in his choices. So his chances of choosing personal vehicles will come down. So such commuters we are categorizing as semi-captive. But here, captive by vehicle ownership is I do not have vehicle at all in my choice set. So obviously they are captive by vehicle ownership. And captive by driving knowledge is where I have a vehicle, but I do not have driving knowledge. Somebody else in my house is having driving knowledge and they are using. So there are two kinds of captive commuters. Or in other words, I need the help of some other person to actually escort me to use personal vehicle. So
Yeah,
that is a
now it
difference.
is clear. Yes, thanks.
So and
Thank you.
to say the shares of each of these segments, I think I need to go to my.
It's okay.
Thesis.
It's okay.
Yeah,
Like that clarity was what I was missing. It's clear right now. Thank you so much.
yeah. Mhm.
If there are no questions, then we can wind up the session. So, Ashwati, please.
Now I call upon Dr. Anila Cyril, Junior Transportation.
Wait. We should not leave Parthan like that, sir.
Sorry, sir.
It's okay. I thought that then others also will ask more questions. Probably. Vasu, you don't have any question?
Sir, Vasudevan has gone for election duty training.
Okay. Okay. And that's good question. Partha, I have a couple of questions. One is you are mentioning about that captivity like a condition, right?
Yes, sir.
Degree of captivity, that's why I thought.
Yes, sir.
This captivity condition is changing over a period of time, no?
Sir, captivity condition?
It may change or it may vary from time to time.
Yes, sir.
No?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
How it will be accounted in your model?
Yeah, sir. So what we did was, now at the cross-sectional data that we collected in 2007, at that time they had a certain condition. So our definitions were at that time based on that particular situation in that year. Then what we thought in this policy was, in the scenario was, we allowed, what we took was, we took data from in the last 10 years. So we, around 2017, we looked at from 2007 to 17, how did these people change? So of course, we do not have long panel data. But what we did was, we looked at the vehicle ownership growth rate in two-wheeler and car in Chennai over that 10 years.
Okay.
Based on Government of Tamil Nadu reports, we had, I think, statistics data they released. And based on that, we simulated how these people would have owned vehicles in these 10 years. Essentially, we assumed a binomial distribution where we allowed for either in the last 10 years, they would have owned no vehicle or one vehicle or two vehicles. So we allowed for 0, 1, 2 options in both two-wheelers and cars. So that means a person who was captive by vehicle ownership in 2007 might have owned one or two vehicles, or may not own a vehicle in the 10 years, and move to, say, captive by driving, semi-captive or choice segment. So that is what we see here, that when we did that analysis, we saw that there was 13% decrease in the captive segment, 9 plus 4. So here what I am highlighting in the slide. And it's led to increase in semi-captive. So they invariably ended up being semi-captive or choice segment. But that could not be done at an individual level. So ideally what we should have done is, we should have gone back to the same commuters and looked at what is their vehicle ownership status now, and then predicted the shares. But that was quite tedious. So we again tracking them down and stuff. So
no, my understanding is, see, probably you would have taken the data during 2011 also. I remember that Moody project was there.
Yeah.
I remember that.
NIT Trichy was also part of the center of excellence.
Correct. Fine. My this one is suppose after that the metro was introduced, whether it is in Chennai or in Bangalore, the effect of that, how we will accommodate that, the effect of that introduction of a new mode, or when the network is expanded, whether it is metro or something that public transport, the buses. How the effect of that one will be accounted, how we can accommodate that one in our model.
Okay, sir. Straight away, one quick thing is, we could use the constants assigned for train, but that is a conventional way. In a utility expression, we use the utility expression for train that could be extended. So that the same alternative specific constants which we have for suburban rail, we could use and replace the attributes with the attributes of the metro. That is one crude way of doing this, including that utility expression in and predicting the metro shares. But changes in the network have to be accounted by measuring the travel times at that point of time. So what we can do is, we can predict the latest ODs, assign them to the network, get the latest congested travel times, and then reassign as the bus travel times in the mode choice models. That is one way. So using the congested travel times by assigning the latest OD metrics.
Okay. You are mentioning about even the policy. Maybe your model can use that one for policy decisions also. No.
Yes, sir.
But yeah, and during your conclusion, you were mentioning. Yes, suppose sir, if I wanted to introduce some policies to increase the public transport share.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Whether it is possible to do that one?
Yes, sir. Actually, I have not shown the results of that here. Maybe I'll show the table. I think you can see the table here.
Yeah. Correct.
One second. Yeah. So I have actually shown. I have actually used the policies. So here I have shown four different scenarios. So the first three columns where I have shown bus fare concession for short and medium trips. So I split the policies into two sets. One is to improve the ridership of sustainable modes like bus or train through policies from conditional choice set stage. And the last one was the policies to improve consideration of bus. So meaning the second, this last column is where I am proposing these policies based on factors which could improve the probability that a bus will get into the choice set of the person. So this policy showed some improvement. So I did it in some steps of 25, 50, and 75. And here the models are showing some improvement in bus shares. So this was a consideration based policy for bus improvement. In case of choice states, I did three things. One was I tested three policies basically. One is if I suppose give subsidies on bus fares for short and medium trips, and what if I provide 15% concession, 30% concession in bus fare, 45% concession in bus fare for only short and medium trips? Because I saw in my model that people who are making short and medium trips were more sensitive to bus fares than long trips. So I saw that around this 20.5% of bus increased to almost 22% in case of this policy. Similarly, I tested one more policy where the bus fare concession was given only to those who own one two-wheeler or those who don't own any vehicle. Again, this concession was 50%, 30%, and 45% concession. So again, I saw that the share increased from 20.5 to 23.5%. Essentially drawing from more from two-wheeler. So you will see that the share decreases from 42 to 40.8. So again, I had one more policy tested. So I have tested it, but in the interest of time, I did not show that in the.
Okay, I can. Probably, NATPAC scientists can explore more in that area. Because during that discussion, Dr. Karthik was explaining about the psychological aspects of the trip makers and all. I still remember that the behavioral aspects of the trip maker, etc. and all. Anyway, probably we can have more discussions on that. Thank you, Parthan. It was a wonderful presentation. Because I didn't listen to you after your defense. No, thank you.
Thank you.
Ashika, probably you can wait.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Now I call upon Dr. Now I call upon Dr. Anila Cyril, Junior Scientist, Transportation Planning Division, to propose the vote of thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of NATPAC, I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to each one of you for joining us today for the TransPedia research talk on the topic, investigating heterogeneity in alternatives, decision rules, contextual variables, and choice set in commute mode choice. It was an enlightening and interesting session, shedding light on how heterogeneity in a variety of decision-making components can lead to differences in mode choice behavior. First and foremost, I would like to express my sincere thanks to our esteemed speaker, Dr. Parthan K, whose expertise and knowledge have truly captivated our audience. Thank you, Dr. Parthan, for delivering an engaging and informative presentation. We are grateful for the knowledge and insights you shared with us today. I would also like to express my gratitude to all the attendees for your presence and active involvement. Finally, I would like to thank our director, division heads, and the organizing team for their support that made the smooth execution of this program. In conclusion, I believe we have all gained valuable insights from today's technical talk, deepening our understanding on how the variations in decision-making elements are resulting in variations in mode choice behavior. Thank you once again to everyone involved, and we look forward to hosting more technical talk in this series and continuing this legacy. Thank you.
I want to thank NATPAC for giving me an opportunity to present my work. Thanks to Dr. Sampson sir and the whole team.
Yeah, thank you, Parthan.
Thank you, sir.
Convey me to Jagadish. Jagadish is still there, no?
Yes, sir. He's superannuating this month.
Okay, okay. So convey my regards to him.
Yes, sir.
Say something.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Good day.